Hello and welcome to my channel. Sit back, close your eyes, and get ready for sleep. First of all, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. What happened to medieval travelers lost in a snowstorm? Picture a traveler somewhere in Europe between the 12th and 15th centuries, moving along a mountain road or an open stretch of countryside as winter light begins to fail. There is no weather forecast to warn of what is coming, no map with marked shelters, no way to call for help if the sky turns. All a medieval traveler had was experience, instinct, and whatever the surrounding landscape offered. When a snowstorm rolled in without warning, it became one of the most dangerous and disorienting situations a person could face in the medieval world, a threat that killed merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and peasants alike, regardless of wealth or status. Travel itself was already a demanding undertaking in this period. Roads, where they existed at all, were often little more than dirt tracks, rutted by cartwheels and eroded by rain, winding through forests, over hills, and across exposed high ground. In mountainous regions such as the Alps, the Pyrenees, or the passes of the Balkans, routes could climb to altitudes where weather shifted rapidly and violently, turning a clear morning into a blinding whiteout within the space of an hour. Travelers moved on foot, on horseback, or with pack animals and carts, rarely faster than a walking pace for any sustained distance, which meant that outrunning an approaching storm was almost never a realistic option. A journey planned to take a single day could stretch into 2 or 3 if conditions worsened, and there was no way to know in advance which kind of day it would be. The medieval traveler's first warning of danger often came from the sky itself. A darkening horizon, a sudden drop in temperature, or a shift in wind direction were read as signs by anyone with experience of the land, since a folk knowledge of weather patterns, passed down through generations of shepherds, merchants, and guides, served as the era's only forecasting system. Experienced travelers in mountainous or northern regions knew to watch the behavior of animals, the color of clouds gathering over peaks, and the particular stillness that sometimes preceded a heavy snowfall. Yet even the most experienced eye could be wrong, and mountain weather in particular was notorious for its unpredictability, capable of producing a storm with little warning, even to those who had crossed the same pass dozens of times before. Once snow began to fall in earnest, the world a traveler knew simply vanish. Visibility could drop to a few feet within minutes, swallowing landmarks, road markers, and any sense of the horizon. Wind-driven snow disoriented even those walking familiar paths, since a falling and blowing snow together erased the visual cues people normally relied on to judge direction and distance. Sound became distorted, muffled by falling snow in a way that made it difficult to tell how far away a companion's voice was, or whether the roar heard in the distance was wind, a river, or nothing at all. For a traveler alone, or separated from a group in these conditions, panic was a real and immediate danger, since disorientation could cause a person to wander in circles, exhausting themselves while believing they were making progress toward safety. Cold itself worked on the body with a cruelty that medieval people understood well, even without the scientific vocabulary later centuries would develop to describe it. Clothing of the period, while often warmer and more practical than popular imagination gives it credit for, heavy wool cloaks, layered tunics, 4 linings for those who could afford them, offered only limited protection once soaked through by wet snow or prolonged exposure. Wet wool loses much of its insulating capacity, and a traveler caught in a storm without shelter would find warmth draining from the body steadily. First as shivering, then as a dangerous, deceptive calm that later medical understanding would come to associate with the final stages of hypothermia. Medieval chroniclers and travel accounts describe this progression in practical terms. Even without formal medical language, travelers growing quiet, moving slower, making poor decisions, and eventually lying down in the snow, mistaking exhaustion for a need to rest rather than recognizing it as sign of the body shutting down. Extremities suffered first and worst. Fingers, ears, and noses, exposed or poorly protected, were vulnerable to frostbite, a condition well documented in medieval medical texts and travelers' accounts, even if the underlying physiology was not fully understood. Surviving medical writings from the period, including works influenced by classical authors like Galen and later Islamic physicians such as Avicenna, whose texts circulated widely in translation across medieval Europe, describe treatments for frozen limbs, though the remedies available, gentle warming, wrapping in cloth, sometimes crude attempts at massage, offered limited real help against severe frostbite, and permanent injury or the loss of fingers and toes was a common outcome for those who survived a serious cold exposure at all. For travelers who found themselves caught far from any settlement, the search for shelter became the single overriding priority, more urgent even than continuing toward their original destination. A traveler with knowledge of the terrain might seek out a natural windbreak, a rock overhang, a dense stand of trees, or the lee side of a hill, anything to reduce direct exposure to wind, which dramatically worsened the effects of cold through what later science would term wind chill, though. Medieval travelers understood its danger through hard experience rather than measurement. Digging into snow itself, counterintuitively, could offer genuine protection, since snow's insulating properties were understood empirically by mountain dwellers and shepherds long before any formal study of thermodynamics existed. A snow shelter, however crude, could trap body heat far more effectively than remaining exposed to open wind. Along well-traveled medieval routes, particularly those used by pilgrims, merchants, and armies, a more organized form of shelter sometimes existed, the hospice or hospitaller house, religious institutions established specifically to aid travelers in dangerous terrain. The most famous of these, the Great St. Bernard Hospice, high in the Alps, founded in the 11th century and attributed to Bernard of Menton, offered food, warmth, and shelter to travelers crossing one of the most treacherous alpine passes in Europe, a route notorious for sudden storms and avalanches. Monks stationed at such hospices, along with specially bred dogs in later centuries, became known for actively searching for travelers caught in poor weather, a tradition of mountain rescue whose roots stretch back into the medieval period itself. Similar institutions, though less famous, dotted other dangerous routes across Europe, reflecting a broader medieval Christian tradition that regarded hospitality to travelers, particularly pilgrims, as a genuine religious obligation, rather than simple charity. Not every traveler was fortunate enough to be near such help. Merchants moving goods between towns, messengers carrying urgent letters, and peasants traveling between villages for trade or family reasons often moved along far less protected routes, with no hospice, no monastery, and no guarantee of finding another human being for miles. For these travelers, survival depended heavily on preparation and local knowledge rather than institutional help. Experienced guides, particularly in mountain regions, were often hired specifically for their knowledge of safe paths, weather patterns, and emergency shelters, a role that could mean the difference between the group's survival and its destruction. Guild and town records from Alpine and Northern European regions occasionally document payments made specifically for winter guides, underscoring how seriously medieval communities took the danger of seasonal travel. Group travel itself offered a significant, if imperfect, layer of protection. A group caught in a storm could combine body heat, share the physical labor of building a shelter, or breaking a path through deep snow and, critically, watch for the signs of failing companions, since a person suffering the early stages of hypothermia often could not recognize the danger in. Tim Salvas. Medieval travel accounts and later folk memory both preserve a grim, but practical piece of winter wisdom. A companion who grew unusually calm, confused, or eager to simply lie down and rest was often in far greater danger than one who remained agitated and afraid, since the deceptive calm of advancing hypothermia could be mistaken, fatally, for simple tiredness. Groups that recognized this danger and forced exhausted companions to keep moving, however cruel it seemed in the moment, sometimes saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to a peaceful, fatal sleep in the snow. When no shelter could be found and no rescue arrived in time, the outcome recorded across medieval chronicles, court records, and local memory was death by exposure, a fate common enough that it appears repeatedly across surviving sources from every region of medieval Europe touched by harsh winters. Chronicles recording unusually severe winters, such as the well-documented cold periods of the 14th century, describe travelers, soldiers, and even entire supply columns lost to sudden storms, their bodies sometimes not recovered until the spring, though revealed what winter had concealed. Armies on campaign were especially vulnerable to this danger, since military necessity often forced movement through weather that a lone traveler would have had the sense to avoid. Medieval military chronicles record catastrophic losses to cold and storm exposure during winter campaigns, losses that, in some documented cases, exceeded casualties suffered in actual battle. Yet, alongside these grim outcomes, medieval sources also preserve stories of survival, remembered and retold precisely because they defied the odds. Pilgrims who stumbled, half-frozen, into a hospice after days lost in a storm. Merchants found alive after being dug from a collapsed snow shelter. Travelers who owed their lives to a stranger's fire glimpsed through the storm at the last possible moment. These accounts, found in chronicles, saints' lives, and local records, were told and retold not merely as dramatic stories, but as genuine lessons in survival, reinforcing communal knowledge about what worked and what did not when the weather turned deadly. Surviving chronicles from across medieval Europe give a clearer picture of just how severe individual storms and winters could become. The early 14th century, and in particular the years surrounding Yandros Swift's Tubunduderses Anthurian, brought a period later remembered as the Great Famine, driven in large part by Katastrophenracher, weather that included prolonged cold, heavy snow, and relentless rain across northern Europe. Contemporary chroniclers writing in England, France, and the Low Countries described roads made impassable for weeks at a time, travel between towns effectively suspended, and messengers and merchants who did attempt the journey sometimes never arriving at all. These were not isolated storms but sustained periods of brutal weather, and the written record from monasteries and town councils, which often tracked grain prices, travel disruptions, and unusual deaths as part of their basic administrative duties, preserved a fairly detailed picture of how deeply winter could disrupt every part of medieval life, travel included. Animals played a role in these dangers that went far beyond simple transportation. Horses, mules, and oxen were not only vehicles, but also, in the harshest moments, a source of information and even survival for their human companions. Experienced travelers and guides paid close attention to how pack animals behaved as weather worsened, since horses in particular were known to grow uneasy, resist moving forward, or attempt to turn back before a human companion might sense real danger, an early warning system rooted in the animal's own sharper instincts. When a storm did close in and shelter had to be improvised, animals themselves sometimes became part of that shelter. Travel accounts and late folk practice both describe travelers deliberately positioning themselves close to or even partially against a horse or ox for shared warmth. A practical use of the animal's body heat in the absence of any other source. The loss of a pack animal in a storm, whether through exhaustion, injury on treacherous footing, or simply being unable to continue through deep snow, often marked the turning point between a difficult journey and a fatal one, since it could strip a traveler of supplies, of a faster means of reaching shelter, none of the animal's own body heat all at once. Rescue, where it happened, rarely resembled anything organized in the modern sense, but it was far from absent. Village and town communities along known travel routes developed their own informal customs for responding to severe storms, rooted less in official policy than in simple necessity and the awareness that any traveler lost near their homes might just as easily have been a son, a neighbor, or trading partner on another day. Church bells, in many regions, served a dual purpose beyond marking the canonical hours of prayer. In bad weather, sustained or specially patterned ringing could serve as an audible landmark, a way for a disoriented traveler within earshot to orient themselves toward the safety of a town or monastery. Some monastic communities, particularly those established in genuinely hazardous mountain terrain, maintained a deliberate practice of watching for travelers during storms and sending monks out to search nearby paths once conditions allowed, a tradition that, at hospices like the Great St. Bernard, would eventually become formalized and, in later centuries, famously associated with dogs bred and trained specifically for locating buried or stranded travelers in the snow. Religious understanding shaped how medieval communities interpreted these storms as much as it shaped their responses to them. A sudden, deadly snowstorm was rarely understood by medieval people purely as a random meteorological event. It was commonly read through a providential lens, as an expression of divine will, a test of faith, or, in some interpretations, a punishment for sin, whether individual or communal. Sermons and religious writings from the period sometimes drew directly on such storms as moral lessons, framing a traveler's survival as a mark of divine favor or the intercession of a particular saint, while a traveler's death might be woven into local memory as a somber reminder of life's fragility rather than simply an unfortunate accident of geography and weather. Saints associated with travelers and travel itself, most notably Saint Christopher, whose legend centered on safely carrying others across dangerous crossings, were frequently invoked by medieval travelers before setting out on any journey considered risky, snowstorm season very much included, and small devotional objects or prayers dedicated to such saints were a common part of a traveler's preparation alongside more practical supplies. Regional geography produced distinctly different versions of this same basic danger. In the high passes of the Alps, storms combined extreme cold with the added threat of avalanches, a hazard well documented in medieval accounts, even without the scientific understanding of snow layering and slope stability that would come centuries later. Travelers and guides in these regions developed practical, experience-based knowledge of which slopes and times of day carried the greatest risk, knowledge passed down orally rather than recorded in any formal text. In Scandinavia, where long, dark winters were simply an annual reality, rather than an occasional hazard. Communities developed correspondingly deep expertise in cold weather, survival, travel, and clothing, reflected in surviving sagas and later medieval legal codes that specifically addressed matters like right of shelter for stranded travelers, obligating households in some regions to take in and warm anyone caught by severe weather near their door. In the mountainous regions of Scotland and the north of England, sudden storms sweeping in from the Atlantic created similarly hazardous, fast-changing conditions, and local chronicles and later folklore alike preserve stories of travelers, drovers moving livestock, and messengers lost to storms that could transform a clear morning into a life-threatening whiteout within a matter of hours. Across the Carpathian Mountains in Eastern Europe, trade routes connecting the Baltic and Black Sea regions passed through terrain where merchants faced comparable dangers, and surviving trade correspondence occasionally notes goods, and sometimes messengers, lost to winter conditions along these routes, a quiet but telling indication of how seriously merchant communities weighed the seasonal risk of travel. Military campaigns conducted in winter provide some of the best documented cases of mass death by cold and storm exposure in medieval sources, since chroniclers attached to royal or noble households had strong incentive to record such disasters, whether to explain a failed campaign or to honor the suffering of soldiers. Winter campaigns in Eastern Europe, including several conducted by the Teutonic Knights against Lithuania and other Baltic peoples during the 14th century, took place deliberately in the coldest months, since frozen rivers and marshland became possible ground for armies that summer's mud would otherwise have swallowed. Yet this strategic advantage came at a steep human cost, and chronicles from these campaigns describe soldiers lost not to enemy action, but to exposure, frostbite severe enough to end a soldier's ability to fight or walk, and supply columns that failed to reach their destination through blinding snow. Similarly, chronicles describing crusading armies moving through the Balkans and Anatolia record devastating losses to sudden cold snaps and mountain storms, losses that in some campaigns rivaled or exceeded casualties suffered in actual combat with opposing forces, a grim testament to how thoroughly winter weather could reshape the outcome of a military campaign regardless of the skill or courage of the soldiers involved. Long-distance trade routes carried their own particular version of this danger, one that unfolded slowly across weeks, rather than in a single catastrophic storm. Merchant caravans moving along overland trade routes connecting Europe to the wider world, including branches of what later historians would brutally term the Silk Road network, as it extended toward Black Sea ports and Eastern European trading cities, faced sustained cold across mountain crossings. Central Asia and the Caucasus that dwarfed anything most Western European travelers encountered. Surviving merchant accounts and trade manuals from the period, including practical guides written for merchants operating along these routes, contain specific warnings about winter crossings, recommending particular months to avoid certain mountain passes entirely, and describing the necessity of hiring local guides with intimate knowledge of seasonal conditions. Frostbite among merchants and their hired porters was common enough to be treated as an ordinary cost of doing business along these routes, and trade records occasionally note reduced caravan sizes or delayed shipments explicitly attributed to winter losses among personnel and pack animals alike. Quiet, but telling record of how deeply seasonal danger was woven into the economics of medieval long-distance trade. For those who survived a severe cold exposure but suffered lasting injury, life afterward could be permanently altered. Medieval medical and legal records occasionally reference individuals who lost fingers, toes, or in severe cases entire hands or feet to frostbite, injuries that, in a world where manual labor formed the backbone of most livelihoods, could mean the effective end of a person's previous trade or way of life. Guild records from some towns include rare references to members seeking exemptions or altered duties due to injuries attributed to cold exposure suffered while traveling on guild business, a small but concrete illustration of how a single dangerous journey could permanently reshape a person's economic and social standing within their community. Religious institutions, consistent with the era's broader charitable obligations, sometimes took in individuals left disabled by such injuries, particularly if the person had been traveling on a pilgrimage or other religiously sanctioned journey at the time, framing the disability as a mark of suffering endured in service of faith rather than simple misfortune. Rivers and coastal waters introduced an entirely different category of winter danger, one that combined the threats of cold with the added peril of water itself. Travelers and merchants relying on river transport, a common and often faster alternative to overland travel in regions with navigable waterways, faced the risk of sudden ice formation, trapping boats mid-journey, forcing travelers to abandon vessels and continue on foot through exactly the kind of exposed, unsheltered terrain most dangerous in a storm. Coastal and short sea travelers, meanwhile, faced the compounding dangers of winter storms at sea, where cold, wind, and the ever-present risk of shipwreck combined into a hazard that medieval sailors and passengers alike dreaded far more than summer crossings of the same waters. Port town records from the medieval period frequently note reduced shipping activity during the harshest winter months, not from lack of demand, but from a widely shared understanding, reinforced by repeated tragedy, that winter sea travel carried a mortality risk few were willing to accept. Undariana necessity. For all this danger, medieval life did not simply stop for winter, and travel, however hazardous, remained a necessity rather than a choice for many. Trade had to continue, pilgrims felt genuinely compelled to complete journeys regardless of season, armies moved on campaigns dictated by political necessity rather than favorable weather, and ordinary people still needed to travel between villages for markets, family obligations, and legal or religious duties. This meant that the dangers described here were not rare misfortunes affecting only the unlucky or the careless, but unaccepted, ever-present risk woven into the basic fabric of medieval life, understood and prepared for as best as the era's knowledge and resources allowed, yet never fully eliminated by any amount of caution or experience. The medieval relationship with winter storms was, in the end, shaped by a stark and unavoidable truth: nature held an authority over human life that no amount of wealth, status, or piety could fully overcome. A king's messenger and a peasant's son faced the same cold, the same blinding snow, the same unforgiving landscape, and the outcome for each depended less on who they were than on preparation, knowledge of the land, the presence or absence of shelter, and, in the end, no small measure of luck. To be a traveler lost in a medieval snowstorm was to be stripped, in the space of a single afternoon, of every advantage civilization normally provided, left with nothing but the body's own dwindling warmth and whatever wisdom, community, or shelter could be found before that warmth run out. Entirely, thank you for listening. Please subscribe and leave a comment.